Welcome all. I want to speak about the outlier in this week's parsha, and I'll explain that. I'm going to talk about the prohibition of basar b'chalav, or meat and milk, when placed in combinations. And not sure where I found the graphic. It's not that great. And first of all, it looks like it's German here, milch. And then this is not actually basar, so to speak, because this is more like poultry. But anyway, the prohibition against this mixture is found in the Parsha. And as I said, it's an outlier, but I'll come back to that in a moment. And this is what the verse reads. It's in the 23rd chapter. The choice first fruit of your soil you have to bring to the house of God. And second half of the verse, which is the one relevant to us, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Lo tevashel gedi b'chalevimo. As you see, that's in the 23rd chapter of Shemot. That's in the Parsha, in this week's Parsha. But this same verse, almost identical, is found in Exodus 34. In fact, I double-checked it. I put the right slide up. And the same thing here. The choice first fruit of your soil shall bring it to the house of Hashem. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And then there's a third instance of this verse, and that one is found in the book of Dvarim. Deuteronomy 14 portion is Re'eh, where it says, Lo tuvashel gedi b'chalevimo, same. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. But I'm going to point out that the introduction to that prohibition is the words Ki am kadosh ata l'Hashem Elokecha. For you are a holy people to God, a people consecrated to Hashem, which is extremely relevant, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So we have three places in the Torah where it tells us about the prohibition of that combination of milk and meat. It's worded in, thou shalt not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Now we need the oral law to kind of explode that and explain it to us. Why three times and what are we talking about here? So the oral law makes it very clear. Lengthy discussion of Talmud Chudim, which is beyond the framework, the parameters, and of this shiur, but tells us the following: three verses prohibiting this combination, because there are three Torah prohibitions about this mixture. The one we're probably most familiar with is that you may not eat it, you may not consume basar, b'chalav, or meat and milk, but it also prohibits us from deriving any pleasure from it in any way, any benefit from it. I'll explain that in a moment. And there's also a prohibition of cooking it, even if you have no intention to do anything at all, with it. So let's begin with that one, because it seems that that's the most direct, literal translation of the word. Thou shalt not cook a kid in its mother's milk, even if you don't intend to eat it, and you're not going to, in fact, have any benefit from it at all. Personally, say you are employed in the restaurant and you're required to prepare dishes. You get a job in McDonald's, and what's the burger with the cheese melting on that meat patty. That's basar b'chalav. You stick that into the grill, and you are cooking milk and meat. But you're not going to eat it. In fact, you're not going to enjoy it. A customer is going to come in and buy it. Maybe an indirect benefit will be that if you refuse to prepare that particular patty, they're going to fire you. So there could be kind of remote benefit. But really, it's the prohibition is already in the cooking. Secondly, obviously, eating it is obvious what that means. But the third verse in the Torah tells us that you may not derive any benefit whatsoever. So, say, somehow, you went to a conference, and they brought you each a McDonald's burger wrapped in paper, and they placed it in front of your place. And of course, you have no intention of eating it, obviously. Can you pass it on to the person sitting next to you and say, hey, I'm not going to have here seconds? Now, where's the benefit? Obviously, if you give somebody a gift, you ingratiate yourself. Can you take it home, put it in your bag, and give it to your domestic who works at home? Again, either you're responsible for the meals, in which case you're saving yourself the cost of the meal, or you simply she's going to be grateful to you for that gift. So you may not, as I said, one, cook the two together. Number two, benefit from that mixture. And number three, quite obviously, eat it. And the introduction to that third mention of the prohibition, that verse, gives us a bit of an inkling of how powerful this is, and this we need to understand why this huge emphasis, ki am kadosh ata, for your holy people. It is as if mixing this meat and milk is somehow interfering in that bond we have with Hashem as a holy people. So we know it's an extremely important and fundamental prohibition. Also, the fact that it's prohibited from benefit. I mean, there are very few forbidden foods that are actually also prohibited from deriving any enjoyment, any benefit from it. I mean, the only one that comes to mind quickly and immediately would be chametz on Pesach. Now we know that's a very severe prohibition. We're not going there now, but it kind of almost fits into a category of its own in terms of the intensity with which we remove chametz from our homes, change over the kitchen completely, and don't allow even the crumb to remain in our house. So that shows the heaviness and the seriousness of this prohibition, and it seems that basar b'chalav, meat and milk, kind of fits into that category. Now, of course, because of this, the body of law around meat and milk is huge. There's a big section of Shulchan Aruch, which is called the Laws of Basar B'Chalav, but that's much literature written about it. First of all, it's not just a goat, it's not just in its own mother's milk, but it's all dairy and meat combinations. Rabbinically, that includes poultry, but not fish. So Torah prohibition talks about a goat, we're talking about meat. Chicken, strictly speaking, is not meat. It's in a category, family of its own, but because of the texture and the taste, by rabbinic decree, it is treated as meat. So, yeah, not only do we not cook them together, but we avoid eating them together. I mean, strictly speaking, if you had a cold patty and you put a slice of cheese on top of it and you ate it together, that's not a cooked mixture. But we avoid all of that completely, to the extent that we have separate dishes for milk and meat, separate sections of the kitchen, separate sink if we're able to, stoves, ovens. Obviously, we live in kind of larger homes that have all those abilities, and little flats in Europe where people have barely got enough space. So in New York, people got barely enough space for one stovetop, and they make a plan. Usually they've got they choose to have the oven say fleshig or milchig, and then they get a little griller or George Foreman or whatever it is. They're going to get one sink, so they're going to use buckets that they put inside the sink. The prohibition goes as far as two people not eating meat and milk separately at the same table, the same meal. So there was a restaurant in Fairmount. It was called, name will come back to me, Tisheli's, and they had meat and milk, and they had a mechitza down the middle. And the most sweetest thing I once saw was a couple coming in, and the forget, but I'm assuming the husband wanted meat and the wife wanted something like a pizza. So they sat on the same restaurant at the joining tables with that chain link fence that separated them. So they could talk to each other, but they were clearly kind of opposite sides. You're not allowed to eat meat and milk at the same table. If you're going to, because you may just reach over, especially if it's a husband and wife, you may reach over, and grab a piece of, her pizza or a piece of his burger while you're eating. So if you're going to be eating fleishig milchig, you're going to kind of create a separation or reminder. Maybe you're using milk and meat placemats. We go as far as waiting between meat and milk. So we've had a meat lunch. We're going to have a milk dinner, but we're going to give a space in between. How long that space is, again, I'm not going to get involved in this now, but customs vary. Customs vary. Because the wording in the Talmud is, if one had meat, he shouldn't eat dairy until the following meal. How much is it between one meal and the next? Well, depends how often you eat. So the accepted practice is 6 hours. German Jews only wait an hour. And then there's this interesting South African custom that I've seen nowhere else, which is 3 hours. And then there's also those who say 6 hours, but it doesn't have to be 6 hours. If you're in the 6th hour, meaning 5 hours plus a minute, that's good enough. I think that's gluttony or hunger that is driving that custom. I'm not sure, but so there's no definite time gap in between. Just the extent of how far the separation goes is that even if you're using milk that is not dairy, you should make that very obvious. So if you're serving coffee after a meat meal, you can't just bring your almond milk or your oat milk or what else they make nowadays, soy milk in one of those little milk jugs, because that would appear, it looks like milk, but you would have to bring it in the original container that clearly says dairy-free milk, so that would be obvious. That's the extent to which we've taken this. I was listening to a shiur earlier because I was just paging through my phone. I found this shiur on meat and milk. I thought, okay, that's interesting. I'm going to talk about that tonight. Let me hear what the rabbi has to say. So it was a bit of I think college girls at Stern College in New York. And the question was, do you need separate dustbins for milk and meat? And one student claimed that her auntie definitely had a meat and milk dustbin. Now, why? Because what happens if you've thrown out your dairy stuff, like your pasta with a sauce, and then you get a meaty sauce or a burger that burnt, and you throw it in the bin at the same time, and then they're both hot and they're cooking in a dustbin. You don't need to have two dustbins. It is not necessary. That doesn't go that far, but it goes far. As you can see, from that one sentence, thou shalt not cook a goat in its mother's milk, we've derived a full body of law. So why this mitzvah? Now I could give you a very short shiur and say to you, there's no reason. It's a chukah, and we have an entire body of law in the Torah that defies any rational explanation or understanding. We just do it because Hashem commanded us, and we leave it at that. And that would be the simplest way of explaining it, particularly as go explain why two kosher substances, milk, meat, you can eat them separately. They're 100%. Okay, you can have Chalav Yisrael milk. You can have, the best hechsher shkita meat. Separately, they are the highest standards of kashrut. You combine them, you end up with something which is prohibited. It defies any explanation, and it would be a chukah, so to speak. And that's probably, when we can say goodnight and have an early one. But that doesn't make sense, and I'll tell you why. because if you look at the parsha it's found in, the parsha is called Mishpatim. And Mishpatim, well, they translate it as rules, but Mishpatim actually means that body of law in the Torah that is logical. Those are the rational laws. We have three categories of mitzvot. We have the chukim, which are inexplicable. We have the mishpatim, at the other extent, which are, rules that make a lot of sense. And then we have in the middle something we call edot, which was probably not the kind of laws we would have come up with on our own, but they are explicable. They can be explained. But our parsha is called Mishpatim, and it's all about laws that can rationally be explained. In the middle of that portion, Mishpatim, as I said, is the outlier, is thou shalt not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So we're told, actually, this teaches us that you got to look for a reason. Even though it is a chukah, even though it is one of those inexplicable mitzvot, but Rambam puts it in the following. He says, to the extent that it is possible, you should always try to find a rational explanation for mitzvot, even for those that appear to be chukim. And this is something he writes in the Laws of Tomorrow. He writes this in the Mishnah Torah in his book of laws. In the Guide to the Perplex, Rambam explains the prohibition of meat and milk as follows. He says, it was an adulterous practice. And it was something that priests in the temples of worship got engaged, got involved in, making meat and milk mixtures. And as a result, we have to stay away from that. And Maimonides there, he explains this by putting context into two of the three instances of this prohibition. The first two texts that are put on the screen, I just put the isolated verse, but the context, both in this week's parsha and in 3 weeks' time, Kitisa, is pilgrimage festivals. And in the middle of the story about going up on pilgrimage and Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and offering sacrifices, it says, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So Rambam says the context gives it away. It's actually a form of worship. And as we're being told that you go and you bring sacrifices to Hashem, the Torah reminds us, but don't do that, because that's what idolaters do, and we don't do that. So that would be kind of one approach, or one way to explain this. There are those who argue, Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplex is often on the controversial side. I don't find this particularly controversial, but he tries very hard to explain all mitzvot in a very simple way. Another who takes the Pshat approach is the Rashbam. He was a grandson of Rashi, but there's a whole bunch of contemporaries of his who take a similar approach. And they said this is actually a cruel practice, and the prohibition against it is to prevent us from falling into cruelty. Apparently, multiple births with goats is common. It's usually twins. And the practice was that farmers would, take one of the births, slaughter that, and obviously the mother who, is granted by nature and Hashem enough milk to feed both of the offspring, but not to get an excess of milk, that was, milked and used to cook the goat in. So there's a whole concept here of cruelty, if you think about it. I mean, you've taken a little baby, a kid that was just born, removed it from its poor mother, and used the resource that Hashem gave the mother to nurture this little thing to make it taste good. So that's kind of a very cruel thing, and milk is a source of life for the baby, and now you're killing him and you're cooking him in that source of life. Of course, that's why it's actually worded a kid in his mother's milk. Though, as I said, the prohibition applies to all animals and not necessarily in their own mother's milk, but in any form of dairy. So that's the Rashbam's approach to tell us that it's one of those mitzvot, the others in the Torah, they're there to teach us to uproot cruelty from within us. Kabbalah takes another approach. Kabbalah says that those are meat and milk represent two very different attributes of emanations of divinity. They don't mix. Meat, which is of a reddish color, represents gevura, represents power, strength, and holding back. Milk, on the other hand, represents a flow, chesed. And chesed and gvura are not compatible. The opposite attributes. So mother's milk, of course, is the gift of giving. You don't combine these two. And in fact, I'm going to show you a thread of other mitzvot in the Torah where we have mixtures that are prohibited. And Kabbalah explains to us that that's the same concept of they come from different sources, they come from different divine emanations, and they have no business being mixed together. So while I pull up the pictures, that should be where? Yeah. You can think of mixtures that are prohibited in the Torah. And of course, the first one that comes to mind is you may not harness to one plow with a donkey and an ox together. Why does the Torah prohibit this mixture? I give the following reasons, two reasons actually. So it's painful for the animal. Apparently the ox is stronger, the donkey is going to lag behind. Of course, you've harnessed them together, and the ox is going to pull the donkey and cause it pain. Another reason is that there's actually psychological pain for a donkey. You see, oxen, cows chew the cud, so they're forever busy, re-chewing yesterday's lunch. That's the nature of a ruminant. Of course, non-kosher species don't do that. So the donkey doesn't do that. Donkey is, getting the feeling that its partner on the yoke, or under the yoke, is being fed while it is not, and that causes anguish. Tza'ar ba'alei chayim. There's also a prohibition against mating animals together. Of course, I don't have a picture for that one. And then we also have these two mixtures, grain and vines. They may not be planted together. Separately, they may be, but to plant them as this farmer here has done, and apparently it's something they do for land. It's called cover farming, and they commonly kind of alternate vines with other crops because that's good for the ground. But that's prohibited in the Torah. Now again, vines are fine on their own. Wheat is definitely fine on its own just as well, but together it becomes a prohibited mixture. And then we have shatnes. We have the prohibition of linen and wool. Now, what do we have in common with all these? They are all, we're talking here about materials, not little cute sheep here, but once they've been shorn and they've had their wool turned, their wool turned into material, and likewise linen, which is also made into an expensive material. What do we have in common here? Two separate kosher or permitted entities placed together. They're going to become prohibited, and the commonality of them all is that we've got gvura and chesed. We've got two different divine attributes that emanate from Hashem, but that are found in this world, and they don't belong together. We may not combine them. Now, with plowing together, of course, with mating together, we can see a new creation being born, with the field being planted with both um, um, vine and grain. We can again see possibly a mixture with shatnez, with linen and wool garments. I mean, you can undo it and unpick it effectively. And commonly, people buy a suit and they take it to a shatnez lab to have it checked to see if it contains that mixture. And if it does, well, then it's usually the linings and they're replaced. So it can be. It's not a permanent. It's still a prohibited mixture. In this world as it is now, and I stress, in this world as it is now, the areas of gvura and chesed, of severity and kindness, do not meet. They remain separate. We live in a world where there isn't a clear distinction between good and evil. That's been going on for a very long time. In fact, it started on day one of creation of the world. Started with Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit, and by eating that fruit, they created a mixture of tov and ra, and created the presence of a yetzer hara who kind of confuses things. And for that reason, because there isn't clarity of good and evil. And because we have yetzer hara in this world, that's why we cannot take things that are from different emanations of the divine and combine them. This is why, interestingly, when Mashiach comes, what's going to happen to the world when Mashiach comes? We'll have cheeseburgers. No. When Mashiach comes, there will be a clarity. There will no longer be a risk, because good and evil will be clearly defined and separate. There won't be any risk and danger in having a mixture of gvura and chesed, and therefore you'll be allowed to eat meat and milk together. And our sources tell us that la'atid or in the world to come, Mashiach comes, and the main achievement, the accomplishment of Mashiach is to bring into the world the clarity of what is divine and what is not, what is good and what is bad, and the yetzer hara then loses the job. He's been working ever since Adam and Eve, ate from the forbidden fruit. He's been helping to confuse good and evil. Final point. In a very publicized biblical story, one of our ancestors is a party to a combination of milk and meat. I'm referring to Avraham Avinu, forefather Abraham, who was visited by angels, and it tells us clearly that he went out and he caught what do they call them? Veal. That's the meat. What they call the little calves. Sorry, he caught calves and he made delicacies, which was, I think, described as tongue in mustard. But he also served them chema v'chalav, it's butter and milk, cream and milk, cheese, whatever it was. So he served them dairy and the fleishik in the same meal. And they ate it. They ate it. But let's remember, they're not from this world. Those are malachim, those were angels that come from the world of clarity. We live in the world of confusion. We live in a world where mixtures such as meat and milk may not be combined because they create a confusion of attributes that God intends in the world as it is to be separate. Doesn't apply to celestial beings, because up in heaven, they're living already today, as our world will be when Mashiach comes with absolute and perfect clarity, which is why, according to Kabbalah, there was nothing wrong at all with angels consuming this mixture of milk and meat. So if you are really pining for this mixture, and yet Sahara tells you it's something you want, there's one solution. Daven harder for Mashiach, please God, he comes and we can all see what that tastes like. Other than that, apparently, cooking an udder, because it's meat and it's got a very high dairy content as well, could be something that would taste like meat and milk. But thank you very much. I think I will pass on that one.